Welcome, everyone. This is our Identity on Blockchains panel, and I'll do a quick intro of myself, and then I'll introduce the panelists. So I'm Susan Poole. I've been in the blockchain space 3 years, and pretty much fully immersed in it. Couldn't get enough of it, I guess. And formerly, I was the Director of Development for the DC-based Chamber of Digital Commerce and built up the blockchain program and membership for them. And currently, I am an advisor to a digital identity startup called Mooti. And on today's panel, I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I think they can do a bit better than me. We have Timothy from Evernym, Katherine from ExistenceID, Jay from IBM, and Steve from Constellation Research. So Timothy, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and your role and tell us a bit about what your company's doing with blockchain and identity.
Thank you. Timothy Ruff. I'm the CEO and co-founder of a company called Evernym. We are the ones who architected and built the only ledger that's been designed from the ground up for identity called Sovereign. And it was donated to the Hyperledger Foundation, where it's named INDY, I-N-D-Y, which is short for Independent Identity. And we'll discover as we go on that we feel that a lot of the ledger implementations are not appropriate for identity. They were built for other purposes. And that what was necessary was to do something fit for purpose, designed for identity. And that true self-sovereignty means that the individual actually is the sovereign and needs to be the owner of their identity with no terms of service or anything else. And so that's how Sovereign and Indy came to be.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Katherine.
Thanks, Susan. I'm Katherine Noall, CEO and co-founder of ExistenceID. So I've been in the blockchain space for about 3.5 years. I also lecture at a university in blockchain and distributed systems, and so that's what I do about 7 days a week. ExistenceID is a distributed storage for identity, and we use blockchain for part of our application, but not all of it. So I'm really a fan of hybrid applications using blockchain.
Thank you, Katherine. And Jay.
Hello, I'm Jay Arun, and I'm the program director at IBM, and what I drive there is our blockchain and identity solutions. And as part of this space, obviously I have been in blockchain space for over 2 years, but I'm not new to the identity space and security space. I have been working in this area for over 19 years in security space and leading many of our IBM's identity and access management products. But this is one of the important area for us to look at, that how we can solve some of the identity-specific challenges, leveraging the blockchain as a nascent and emerging technologies. So glad to be here on the panel today.
Great. Thank you, Jay. And last but not least, we have Steve.
Thanks, Susan. Steve Wilson from Constellation Research. We are a small analyst firm based in San Francisco dedicated to disruptive tech and innovation. I'm an identity specialist. I lead a body of research called Digital Safety, Privacy and Identity. And so I come at blockchain from that direction. I'm currently working on a large market overview of third-generation blockchain technologies, and I will disclose that I'm a privacy advisor to Evernym on a DHS project, and my research has been recently syndicated by IBM. Thank you.
Okay, well, we definitely are in the right room for some blockchain expertise. And before we get started, I just wanted to ask the audience, has anyone been to any type of other than maybe today, but any other type of blockchain event or panel? If you've been to one of these before, I know a lot of people come out of the identity space. Oh, fantastic. Okay, so we have a great mix. Terrific. Okay, well, just to throw the panel completely off the loop. No, my original question was going to be, what is the value that blockchain brings to identity? But I'd like to make it a two-part question. What's the value that blockchain actually brings to identity? Or does blockchain bring any value to identity? So I'm going to go ahead and start with Jay. Excuse me.
Yeah, I'll take, as Susan mentioned, bring the two things here or address two specific things in this aspect. So one important thing for us to address is what blockchain provides, and then also look at what are the problems that we see in identity space today, and then understanding that how does blockchain bring value to those things. So let's start first that what blockchain provides in a nutshell. There are four primary capabilities that I see or we see as in IBM in terms of blockchain. So blockchain, obviously a distributed ledger technology, and then a capability called smart contracts, and then also security and privacy elements from encryption and other things. And then also fourth thing is called consensus. So I think collectively these capabilities, if I look at from identity perspective, that how do we see these capabilities? Distributed ledger, primarily, can we look at the identity which is already decentralized? Can we do the decentralized identity management using a capability which gives you the distributed ledger? So that's one aspect. Second is the aspect of smart contracts. When I have my identity information shared with the different entities, organizations, either healthcare, you talk about retail or government or banks, would there be a particular set of agreement and policy between me or consent in between me and many of those providers or even users of my information? So how do we manage those kind of identity attributes exchange, and would these smart contracts be a better way to use that? And the third capability, we all know that the security and privacy is one of the primary founding pillar of blockchain. So can we use that to highly encrypt our private information that we have about our personal or identity related attributes? So that's aspect. And then fourth one is consensus. So when these transactions on identity that we put on blockchain, can we basically trust them, and do we need to have a consensus built across the parties and the entities in order for us to have these transactions put on blockchain or any other record or a ledger or a system of record? So these are the four things that bring specific value to blockchain or specific value to identity space, because we have to look at the other aspect is identity. What's the problem in identity space today?
Okay.
So,
we can't answer that one yet. Okay.
Sure.
Thank you for those four good points. I'll just repeat the question. Thank you, Jay. For Katherine, what is the value that blockchain brings to identity, or does it bring value to identity?
I do believe that it brings value to identity if it's used in the right way. And 6 months to a year ago, people would have said it was the ultimate solution and you should blockchain identity, and it would be the storage mechanism for that. And that is absolutely the wrong approach, because I think blockchain is probably the world's worst database. So it should not be used in that sense, but it does have some value in terms of being able to provide single global proof that can't be changed. And that is really useful from a verification point of view. So if it's used for that, then it's great. Blockchain itself isn't great for storage, but if other distributed technologies are used for storage, which are very similar and employ cryptography in the same sort of way, then I think we have much higher levels of security available for things like biometric storage and storage of other really sensitive information. And there aren't projects using that enough at the moment. So I think that's an area where there will be increasing use of these technologies.
Thank you, Katherine. And Steve, does blockchain bring value to identity? And if so, how does it work?
How about no?
How about no?
How
Timothy.
how about we're really clear about what blockchain we're talking about? And I think Timothy's already alluded to the fact that Sovereign had to go through an evaluation process and looking at the problems that they were trying to solve. If we look at the original blockchain that was built for Bitcoin, the problem that it solved was for Alice and Bob to exchange real money between each other without knowing each other, without trusting each other, and without knowing anything or trusting any third party or institution. It was designed expressly to move electronic cash without an intermediary, so that you didn't have to trust. So it beggars belief that organisations like The Economist magazine somehow thought that it would conjure trust when it was exactly to not do trust, ever. And so equally, it's amazing that anybody thought that the original blockchain had anything much to offer identity, because identity is almost the opposite. So, guess what? It was a purpose-built technology for a very specific problem, very specific. It came at a time when a lot of people, for very good reasons, are re-questioning identity and trying to work out whether or not we can, in some sense, decentralise identity, in some sense we can return control to people. We definitely want to upset the apple cart and get rid of the power and the superpowers that control identity. It's just a coincidence that blockchain has similar properties. And so unfortunately, a lot of people had a rush of blood to the head originally and thought blockchain could do identity, blockchain could also do healthcare, because isn't that about trust? These things were false intuitions. And I've got to say that in my 20 years in identity management, we have suffered a lot of false intuitions about identity. And blockchain's just another one. The good news is that a number of independent people at the time thought, it doesn't actually stack up. Some people tried it. Some people just from first principles said blockchain's not about trust. What problem are we trying to solve in identity? And some very good work was done by a number of players, Evernym, SecureKey, Hyperledger, on taking some time, rethinking what the problem's all about and coming up with a ledger technology that has some of those original qualities of blockchain, but really re-implements the questions of consensus and order and integrity and synchronization.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Timothy, what value does blockchain bring to identity? Does it? What's your thoughts?
I'm going to agree with everything that Jay and Katherine and Steve have said and take it a little bit of a different direction. And that is distributed ledger technology is not necessarily blockchain. That blockchain, as we know it, is great for cryptocurrency, great for smart contracts and the things that it was designed to do. And I think wholly inappropriate and not fit for purpose for identity. But distributed ledger technology, on the other hand, the broader category, is an amazing breakthrough for identity. And in the sense that it enables something that was impossible before, and that is truly self-sovereign identity, where there are no terms of service, where no one can take away an identity, where I can have an existence without having to host any equipment. And this is very, very important, especially in at-risk populations around the world. And there's a lot of babies and birth registration issues around the world and all kinds of things for them, but also for us. For us in the first world who don't have some of those more basic needs, it enables a path toward truly peer-to-peer interaction. If you think about peer-to-peer interaction today, you might think of Airbnb or Uber. But really, are those P2P? There's a big platform in the middle. It's really P2P2P with a big platform that requires the two people to find each other and to interact. With truly self-sovereign identity, you can have genuine peer-to-peer interactions between any person, organization, or thing and any other person, organization, or thing. They can now connect directly, authenticate each other, and literally, Susan, I can authenticate you just as strongly as the bank can. Why couldn't I? If you are a peer to me, or this intelligent microphone becomes a peer to me, and maybe this is only set aside for my use at this time, why can't we authenticate and have a direct peer-to-peer relationship? And that becomes possible with distributed ledger technology. It was never possible before.
I don't know if anybody else caught that, but we've got some talk about blockchain and then distributed ledger. So I'm going to throw a wobbly in, as the Aussies say. I'm going to throw a wobbly question in. Who wants to put their hand up and say, is it blockchain? Is it distributed ledger? What's the difference? Timothy? You did put your hand up?
If there's blocks and chains, it's blockchain.
Okay. Anyone else want to chime in on that?
It's going to become a sore point, I think. There's it's early days, so I think that we need to say early days. I find myself a bit torn between being semantic and being pedantic. I think that we don't want to be too pedantic about this, but semantics matter. We need to know what we're talking about. We need to know what the meaning is. My personal view is that I think the blockchain is something that has a great deal of meaning and a great deal of currency, and in fact a great deal of validity. There's still plenty of people that want to use the blockchain for Bitcoin, and that's a use case that's entirely legitimate. It's arguable, reasonable people can argue about Bitcoin and the dark web, but technically it's a good thing, and I think it's a meaningful thing. So I advocate using the term blockchain to mean the Ethereum and the Bitcoin original public permissionless ledgers. There are a number of organisations, IBM and Microsoft R3, who all say that the term blockchain, like the term cloud, is something that is still descriptive of this new technology wave that we're into. Some people have called it a movement. I think that's a bit woolly. The idea that there is a ledger technology that's evolving, and let's still call it blockchain, you know, I know what they mean, but with respect, I think that that's muddying the waters. I think that we need a new technology. I think DLT still doesn't do it for me, because actually some of the newer ones aren't distributed at all. Dave Birch, sure. I think we should acknowledge, talks about shared ledger. And I think that that's a work in progress. I still don't know that that's the right word. I'm thinking about synchronized ledger technologies, arbitration, because the problems that characterize the new applications are multiple people coming together to address some shared data and to reach consensus about something about that data. So there's an aspect of synchronized agreement to the state of a piece of data.
Okay, I'm gonna keep going on because the panel's passionate about all this, I can tell. So I'm going to keep going. Quickly, Jay or Katherine or both, did you have anything to add on that? Or
I tend to agree with what Steve has mentioned, that especially that you have to understand what use cases and what value this distributed ledger technology will provide you. Because it's, as he mentioned, we may need to evolve that technology to a level when it can satisfy all the requirements, right? In identity space, yes, we have to build on top of this distributed ledger technology. And when someone uses blockchain, does that blockchain includes every bells and whistles we talk about, including distributed ledger? That's one of the things. So we have to look at blockchain as a entire platform that can support you these capabilities to satisfy the needs.
Okay. Any other thoughts on that, Katherine? Or
when you look at distributed ledger technologies, you get very close to distributed compute, which is traditional computing, but then in a distributed way. And although it's very attractive to say, well, let's just come up with a new term that covers everything, if it's distributed compute and database based, then it's not distributed ledger technology and has a very different security profile. And I would like to see a very strong distinction between those technologies. Otherwise, we'll end up with more traditional technologies getting this new label and consumers being very confused about what they're getting.
Can I mention one thing? Blockchain has a bad name in a lot of ways. It has a great name. There's the whole hype cycle, right?
Right.
There's some who are way at the top of the hype cycle, and some are clear in the trough. And I don't want distributed ledger technologies to be thrown out with the bathwater. With that people are negative about blockchain. And when Katherine mentioned it's a terrible database, I don't know what the exact numbers are. I'm sure some of you can. But if you think about the cost per transaction on Bitcoin, how much energy is expended for a single transaction to occur, it's like enough to power a city or something, or a home for a day, or I don't know. It's some bad amount. It's a tremendously inefficient, wasteful protocol, but it does some amazing things.
Okay.
And so we don't want to throw it away entirely, but I don't want the beauty of distributed ledger technology and the breakthrough that it represents for identity to go down with some of the baggage that blockchain unfortunately carries.
Okay, thank you. Now, so that's a great segue. We're here for identity and blockchains. So I talked to some people yesterday and last evening, and I got some really interesting feedback that identity has been a burgeoning, important industry as well. And blockchain kind of just, like slammed on like a force, right? And so where's kind of the bridge between the existing identity solutions that are out there? As blockchain technologists and thought leaders and all those other cool things that I'm going to tell you that you are, where's this going with the current identity market and blockchain technology coming up? Is there a bridge there? Is it leap over the top? And this time I'm going to start with Steve.
Oh, I thought you'd start with one of the 2 or 3 people that are actually doing it on the panel. I'm an observer. I'm a humble observer of how.
But I know you have a view.
My view is that we need to be really precise about the problems that we're trying to solve. I actually ignored blockchain for a year or two. I came across the Bitcoin paper really early on, and as a crypto guy, I knew what they were trying to do, and I knew that it was an unsolvable problem. And when unsolvable problems get solved, it creates waves of innovation, and that was exciting. But to me, it was academic because Bitcoin personally doesn't rock my boat. It's not something I need to do or my clients need to do. So I set the paper aside. In 2015, I was at another identity conference, a big one, and blockchain came up, and by show of hands, about 6 people out of 600 had even heard of Bitcoin, let alone were doing stuff. And yet, at that time, there were at least 15 identity blockchain startups. This is mid-2015. And it occurred to me, as an identity guy, that everybody that was doing identity on the blockchain were not identity people, they were blockchain people. In fact, they were Bitcoin people. And they were making this leap of faith. And of course, there was a huge land grab of not just identity, but any application you can think of at the time. And it occurred to me as an analyst that when a whole bunch of people are trying to put 2 and 2 together, but they only understand one side of the equation, which was Bitcoin, that was amazing to me. And then I got interested. So I spent a long time then trying to understand what we're trying to do. And on the face of it, there is, Bitcoin was to solve the double spend problem. Blockchain was to solve the double spend problem. On its face, there is no double spend problem in identity. It's just not that sort of thing.
So how do you see, still on Steve for another minute, how do you see blockchain benefiting identity? And is it and what's that path going to be like in your view?
The benefit of these ledger technologies, be they distributed or otherwise, is that they are reaching agreement about something, and it turns out to be metadata. It turns out that the powerful thing in Bitcoin is metadata. The important thing about consent and the attributes that go with consent is provenance. So it's not just what you know, but how do you know? I can tell you my date of birth, but you're not going to believe me until I tell you how I believe that my date of birth. So the provenance of attributes is important, where that provenance comes from. And occasionally you do get synchronization and real-time problems in identity, especially around consent. So how do you know that 3 or 4 people have agreed to consent to something? How do you withdraw consent? When identity is applied to things like electronic health records, it becomes really hairy. And so you do have synchronization and agreement. I want to stop using the word consensus because it's so loaded. If you're trying to reach agreement about the state of data, and when there's identity metadata attached to it with provenance, I think that these distributed shared ledger technologies become very powerful. Ironically, not to steal anybody's thunder, but maybe just to put it out there, there is very little identity data on any of these blockchains. The idea about putting PII on a blockchain, I think, is well past.
Okay, good. And I'm going to segue to that as a next question. I'm going to go to Jay now. So Jay, working for IBM, IBM's been around a while, probably been identity IBM a while, I'm sure. So what's happening to get blockchain connected with identity, or is it just blockchain identity going forward?
Yeah, so obviously in IBM, what we are doing is having 2 fundamental principles, and some I do agree with Steve and some are different perspective than Steve shared. So 2 fundamental principles that we are going with. So as Tim mentioned earlier, self-sovereign concept. We have been seeing lots of greater initiatives from World Bank ID4D or many other initiatives that you look at from UN and others. And even talking to many standard bodies and all together, obviously there's a need for all of us to have better consent, control, and visibility to our identity information. As part of that, we need to make sure that we are in control of our identity information. That leads us to this concept of self-sovereign. So that's one of the principles that we have been looking at. That's why one of the project that Tim mentioned is part of the Hyperledger community Indy project. And we have been looking at how we can basically look at Hyperledger Fabric and Indy and all of these capabilities come together. So that's one aspect. One more point I would like to mention is second principle is about the concept that I have different perspective than Steve is just the terminology aspect, the distributed trust model. So why do we talk about the trust is not, because trust is this word which is known and understood differently in a different context. But in this context, what we are looking at when identity is decentralized, it is held by different entities, either DMV, DHS, bank, my employer, any of those. How do you attest, authorize, or basically validate that information from these sources to make a business transaction in a particular context so that I can get my identity attested, verified, proved in a distributed manner? That's the concept that we are talking about, distributed trust. I might have currently point-to-point trust with my banks or with my employer or with my government agency, but will there be requirements when you need to have some of these attributes collectively verified in a distributed manner to make a business transactions? That's the concept that we talk about, the distributed trust, which I think resonates with decentralized identity management.
Thank you. It's got two fantastic responses there. Fantastic. So I'm going to go to Katherine next, and we're talking about blockchain, identity. How do we get there? What's going to happen?
I think if you look at other industries and what they've gone through when blockchains collided with them and people have got enthusiastic, is that it's been really difficult to apply blockchain and get huge change. And so you have seen people that know nothing about the industry trying to do things. And one of the significant reasons for that is that the architectures for blockchain solutions are so radically different for traditional solutions. So you would need to make huge changes to processes, organizations, and that's just too difficult. So I think we're almost going to see parallel developments of new things and old things.
Okay, very interesting. And Timothy, what's your view here?
You know, there's a lot of aspirational thinking about what can be done, and that's really wonderful to think about what can be done. But I honestly don't think anything's going to happen until a problem can be solved that some business actually wants to pay for, and pay for over and over and over again, either because they're making more money or they're saving money, but they're solving a problem that couldn't be solved with today's technology. And that until there's actual products in the marketplace that solve problems that other products don't solve, then I don't know what the purpose is.
Thank you. I'm actually going to add a little point in there too. There's an additional perspective of, with some of this digital identity and identity technology utilizing blockchain, that is that going to change things for identity providers? Will they be able to take new types of peer-to-peer or distributed ledger or blockchain technologies and expand their business footprint because there may be a way for them to actually grasp onto some of that identity and monetize it? So that's just a thought out there on what also could happen in the future. So we've got about 5 minutes left. Excuse me. And then we're going to go to questions. So I'm going to pick a final question here. Oh, okay. This is good. So having said all that, we might get there in parallel, we might leap over, business might drive it. It's a bit more in depth than that. So in your own view, what do you think that the biggest impact is? That distributed ledger technology or blockchain or self-sovereign identity? What's the biggest impact that's going to come from this blockchain wave? And I'll start with Katherine.
The biggest impact will be an increase in security and privacy where that's required, and that won't be noticed in markets where that's not highly valued. I would agree with the fact that it needs to solve problems. So where there are markets where that's an absolute requirement, then you'll see huge adoption.
Fantastic. Timothy?
I think more strongly authenticating people is a minor benefit, and I don't think that's enough to drive this technology forward. I think the revolutionary thing here is that people can have truly peer-to-peer interactions with no intermediary. And when you can discover other people and have an interaction, whether it's a payment or sharing data or it's just simple communication, with literally no email provider in between you. I mean, just peer-to-peer and no platform, I just think that opens up an entirely new world of interactions that's very exciting, and it evens the playing field for anyone to offer any services to anyone else.
Interesting. And Steve, what's the biggest impact that this technology is going to make on identity?
Yeah, very specifically, to amplify Timothy's point about peer-to-peer, removing the intermediaries and therefore removing the breadcrumbs as well, removing those digital trails that just bedevil people's privacy online. There are some new protocols. You know, the concept of blinded and double-blinded protocols have been around for a long time now, but they're usually incredibly intermediated, ironically. They usually involve an intermediary who knows everybody, over-registers people a la KYC on steroids, and then promises that I'm going to keep all of that stuff secret and just reveal piece by piece people's ages or people's credit histories. And it's an absurdly over-engineered sort of thing when you think about it. Usually these intermediaries are new businesses that have come in, like look what happened to PKI in the 80s and 90s. New businesses come in, and then there's churn and they get taken over, and 10 million records become a core asset that's on the sale block. So that idea of creating new markets that people flood into and then ruin privacy is something that needs to change. So the idea that we might have peer-to-peer exchange of just what people need to know, with no intermediaries, and yet high reliability in the provenance of the things that people are revealing. That is really new. And the idea of disintermediating the information brokers that are at the core of identity, that is going to be radical. That'll be good.
Interesting. Okay. And Jay, the question is, what's the biggest impact that blockchain is going to make in identity?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, as I mentioned early on, there are 4 core capabilities that blockchain brings. And what's the value of those 4 in the context of identity is the answer here is that obviously we need to look at how the technology is implemented in order to meet the problems that all of us have discussed about identity. So that's first thing. And how do we address those problems and the value that the blockchain can bring to this idea is all, I would say, obviously trust, transparency, based on the concept of security and privacy, those elements that if are implemented right, that's the big if here. So that's one of the things. But I see that it brings, because when we see fundamentally blockchain, it's made for you have an asset, it's going through multiple parties, and they would like to have trust, transparency across those transactions that happen. So I see a huge opportunity for blockchain in that context, if implemented right.
So that's if implemented right. Well, we've got about 15 minutes left, and it would be fantastic if anyone has any questions. This is really a great panel up here of expertise. So there you go. Do you want to just say your name or where you're from, or you don't have to? Either way.
Is this a trusted panel?
Yes.
Randy Schaefer, I'm a management consultant with a lot of experience in financial industry, having touched on LEIs and a lot of payment stuff over the years. Just a simple question for the Evernym.
Timothy from
yes,
Evernym.
thank you. Will there be a Yelp assessment attached to me in 10 years' time? We talk about me being able to trust you and you being able to trust me without a platform, which, again, from my DTCC days, what that organization does is it vets both sides. Airbnb vets both sides. So when I'm dealing with you to sell you something that we've never met, how do we control the DVP, delivery against a payment, and that the quality that I'm getting from you or you're getting from me is real? That's where Yelp comes in for restaurants. So is Randy Schaefer going to be Yelped in 10 years' time?
That's a fantastic question. Timothy?
Excellent question. And the 4 of us will get together and interview you and post everything and decide our opinion about you, and that'll be it. No, I encourage everybody to look into verifiable claims. There's a task force at W3C called Verifiable Claims. And the fundamental capability, I think, is actually inseparable from self-sovereign identity because of the answer to the excellent question. It enables anyone, whether it's a person, organization, or thing, to present a claim of any kind, and for the recipient of that claim to decide if that is authentic or not and whether they want to trust it. There is no governing body that says this is trustworthy and that is not. It is up to the 2 individuals to decide based on what is presented and what is received, whether they trust it or not. So let me give an example with fake news. So with fake news, if I were
Wait
to
a second, that wasn't on the agenda for today.
Can I give an example?
It's very timely and relevant.
Okay. So let's say that I put forward a news story and you receive it and you're wondering if it's fake news. It sounds a little bit hard to believe. If I present it to you as a verifiable claim, you can instantly verify and authenticate the source of that story as being from NBC. Cryptographically assured, that story is from NBC. But the contents of the story, there's no guarantee whether that story is true or not, but you can verify its source and its authenticity. That's how verifiable claims work, and it's up to the two parties to exchange claims and decide what they trust and what they don't.
Oh, we got a quick follow on, and then we're going to jump to a couple more people.
So it's up to me to decide that I'll accept NBC as having done their homework. But if it came from who knows who, then I'd say.
Exactly, and that opens up the opportunity for the Yelps of the world to actually provide trust in that environment. And both parties can say, I want to, if this guy hasn't registered with this private, rating bureau or credit bureau or whatever, then I'm not going to trust it. And so that market gets to come to be naturally and organically exactly the way the rest of the world works.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for the question.
Hi, I'm Craig Jolly from the Center for Digital Development at USAID. I wanted to kind of continue on a similar theme of I find myself a little bit skeptical about these claims that distributed ledger technology will remove all intermediaries between the interactions of completely sovereign individuals, just because on the one hand you've got, for individual people accessing any kind of digital network, you've got either mobile network operators or internet service providers acting as kind of these on-ramps that are giving people access or providing access. And on the other hand, you've got designers of user interfaces that are making choices about what that interface is going to look and feel like for people and what options are going to be presented to them. And I'm probably saying things you've already thought about, but I'm curious what ideas you have about how much people are really going to notice that those intermediaries have been removed and how different that's going to feel for most users who are not information security experts.
Okay, thank you for the question. I'm going to ask one of the additional panelists to take it.
Well, I think one of the really important themes as we get practical with these ledger technologies is they're re-intermediating, or they're intermediating differently, to sort of go the Nike path, I guess. Intermediate different. It's certainly the case that the original blockchain was only really good for purely digital assets. And the important thing about some of the new technologies is that they're better at marrying the off-chain processes and the on-chain. Off-chain is always a reality. Timothy's right that one of the really recurring themes at the moment is verified attributes or verified claims. There's an enormous contest of ideas out there about the provenance of things and the provenance of data. Provenance is an off-chain matter. It's got to be done somehow. And in fact, Nakamoto's going to roll in his/her grave, but third parties are absolutely necessary because provenance means nothing without a third party. So call them intermediaries, call them agencies, call them authorities. There is always some sort of authority going on. Now that can sometimes be a self-authority, and if I understand self-sovereign, a part of that is the community of people are going to grant legitimacy to the claims that one makes about oneself because those claims are being continuously tested and hardened. So maybe ledgers provide a new medium for capturing that process, and that's powerful. But by and large, you're absolutely right, especially in areas of refugees and government service. There are going to be authorities involved, and maybe they're not intermediaries, but they're absolutely third parties that are involved off-chain. So it's complicated in new ways.
Thank you. I'm going to go to our next question.
I wanted to follow up Elizabeth's point about databases. So,
Katherine, actually,
Katherine,
but
I
that's
apologise. Catherine's point about databases. So, ledgers aren't databases. Ledgers are lists of transactions, and so auditable lists of transactions. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask the panel kind of generally, what kinds of identity transactions would they envisage being stored in these ledgers? Because if we're not storing the identity, if we're storing identity transactions, what are those transactions? And specifically, I'm very curious about the IBM case because we had a little case study of that yesterday. So in that case, so what are the transactions that are being stored in this ledger? I'm just curious to know.
That's great. We'll start with Jay, and then Katherine, you can also jump in.
Yeah, absolutely. So
Thank
from
you.
identity transactions perspective, I think one of the things that we are all talking about here is how can we ensure the trust and transparency aspect. So one of the aspects here is that what transactions that you would like to have onto the blockchain where you can like confidently share that information on blockchain. So many cases, I think two schools of thought we are seeing in the implementation perspective that do you really need to put all the data onto blockchain, or are you putting hash of the data onto the blockchain? So from that perspective, the transactions are in many cases, you are putting the transactions onto the blockchain, but do you have the real identity or PII on the blockchain? So I think that's the different question, because we have been seeing some implementations are not putting the real information onto the blockchain, but the hash for two reasons. One is absolutely where the technology is maturing, because you don't want to have gigabytes of or millions of gigabytes of information on blockchain, and blockchain is just trying to extract the information and keep like churning all of the data to make any of the business transactions and analytics or any of those things done. So I think it's important for us to know that what information you want to put on blockchain, but from our perspective and what we have been seeing the implementations, the identity transactions that say, I am exchanging my identity information and attributes. I have the consent on these attributes. So the aspects of those consents, the aspects of those transactions, what attributes I'm sharing with whom, those activities are going on to the blockchain as of now.
Okay, and sorry, thank you. Just taking a breath. Thank you, because that is a hot topic. What is actually stored on a blockchain? Katherine, what's your view on this?
I would agree that you don't store actual identity documents or personal information. So what we store are hashes of a global ID score, which is the total value of somebody's identity portfolio. And we also keep a record of identity transactions for audit purposes, and that's the extent of it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more question, if anyone's keen.
There's no instant. Do you mind if I add
Oh, I'm sorry.
a point to this?
Of course. Perfect.
I want to have a friendly disagreement. I don't think even hashed data should go on the ledger. And Steve and I would agree on this from a privacy standpoint. Even if a piece of information is hashed, if you use it over and over again, then the places you use it can see the same information. Even if they can't decrypt the information, they can see the exact same hash. That's the purpose. That's the way it works. And now they can start to correlate and figure out everything you're doing. And the thing about when Facebook first started doing their single sign-on, they would use the same identifier for Susan everywhere you logged in with Facebook. And after a little while, they thought, that's a bad idea. All these private companies in their private databases could go compare Susan's ID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and figure out Susan's been here, she's been there, she's been there. And these were private companies in their private databases that Facebook was concerned about. So they wised up about this and they moved to something called pairwise identifiers, where they would use a unique identifier for every single website that you signed in on. So now these companies could get together and there would be no way that they could figure out that this was Susan and Susan's been here and she's been everywhere. Now, you take that same problem, you put it on an immutable public ledger, and you use the hash over and over and over again. Well, now not only can people correlate your activities, they can do so forever.
And I would like to bring up also, for some of the people newer to blockchain, there are public ledgers and there are private ledgers. And we don't have time to get into all of that today. So I want to thank first I want to thank the audience. It's like standing room only. This is great to see. Timothy from Evernym, Katherine from ExistenceID, Jay from IBM, and Steve from Constellation Research. I'm Susan from Mooti. So thank you very much.